Good evening, friends, and welcome to this evening's 20 questions. For those of you who haven't attended one of these, the format is quite simple. Heather Richardson will briefly lay out the context of the main arguments of her Facebook posts on shock events and the Trump presidency. She'll be followed by our panelists who will each pose initially one brief question. Heather will respond to these initial questions, whose main purpose is to demonstrate diverse and divergent approaches to the issues raised by the post. The cut and thrust of the initial encounter will then be followed by a discussion amongst the panelists, and we will open up to the audience. This event follows on a discussion we organized the day after the election with Danielle Allen, David Lapson, and Jill Lepore, an event that was appropriately called Dark and Stormy. 4.5 months later, 2 months into the Trump presidency, we can take a different, though not less urgent, perspective. We are, in my view, not living in a divided country of narrow margins between the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. This is not, I believe, a divided democracy. The country is rent by a kind of seismic fault, not a division, but a dark chasm, and that sends erratic and unexpected aftershocks across all the constituencies that are part of the national polity. I don't think we can see this in polar terms. When a crack opens up on our political rationality and our sense of community is confronted as much by a political panic and confusion as by an affective anxiety, and our institutionalized democratic interests and instincts are at once outraged and overcome. The terror lies in the swift action of erasure and extinction by alternative facts, executive orders, by the rude, raw rhetoric of insult and imperviousness, by lies and stealth, by the insouciance of unconstitutional behavior. When the country is shattered by a seismic fault, suddenly things move fast and unpredictably on all sides. There's a kind of wobble, which is what we see every day amongst a range of political communities. And I believe that this is the birth of movement politics, as Bannon and his Breitbart accomplices remind us quite explicitly and very cogently. They don't give a damn for greater national attention to the white working class, nor are they particularly concerned to provide a critique of the iniquities of global and digital capitalism. They see the chasm, with all its perils and precocity, as the space from which to arouse a movement, a populist, racist, nationalist, misogynist, certainly anti-migrant movement. And in response to it, there has to emerge a movement of aligned alternatives and visions that will discover new solidarities in the aftershocks of the tremor. We are in the age of movement politics, literally moving in both affective and actional ways, and who will reap the whirlwind. As Heather Richardson writes, hopefully, because shock events destabilize a society, they can also be used positively. We do not have to respond along the old fault lines. We could just as easily reorganize into a different pattern that threatens people who sparked the event. Heather Cox Richardson is professor of history at Boston College. Her History of the Republican Party to Make Men Free examines the fundamental tensions in American politics from the early republic to the present. Her Facebook posts in response to the first Muslim ban executive order went viral. Stephen Beale is executive director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, senior lecturer on history and literature. His books include Down with the Old Canoe, A Cultural History of the Titanic Disaster. It's an appropriate preparation for where we are going. Bart Bonikovsky is associate professor of sociology. He's the author of many publications with a focus on populist claims making in political discourse and popular identification with the nation. Claudine Gay is Dean of Social Science and Government and head of the African American Studies. Her research and publications explore American political behavior, public opinion, minority politics, and urban and local politics. James Kloppenberg is Charles Warren Professor of American History. His most recent book is Toward Democracy, The Struggle for Self-Rule in European and American Thought. Richard Tuck is Frank G. Thomas Professor of Government. His books include The Sleeping Sovereign, The Invention of Modern Democracy. I am sure that this will in itself constitute a shock event, and I'm delighted that you're with us this evening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it is a great pleasure to be here. Not least because on this day, 33 years ago, at this university, I turned in my undergraduate senior thesis in the hopes that I would be admitted to do graduate work here. And it worked, but if you'd told me 33 years ago that I would be standing here to talk about a new technology and how it went viral, I think I would have told you that you or I was delusional. In any case, I've been asked to speak for about 15 minutes about where the shock event post came from and why I think it's important, which is quite possibly different than why the people on the panel think it's important. So let me lay out what happened. I spent half of my life not in Boston. I spent it in a town that is full of Trump voters. And I had been up for 2 nights, much too late, writing a couple of pieces. One for a publication I love to write for because I love the editor. I'm not going to mention that one because the piece I wrote for them was rejected that day. But the other piece was for The Guardian. It's one of the smartest pieces I've written. I was very proud of it. It was too long, but it was smart. I felt really contented, and I had about 4 hours to kill. So I sat down on my laptop to play, which is my idea of relaxing. And that was just when the travel ban came out. And I watched people on my Facebook page, both on the left and on the right, going hysterical over this ban for different reasons. And it hit me as a political historian that what I was seeing happen as a political historian looking at the way people were moving that day was not the same story that other people were seeing. It was a Saturday, late on a Saturday. I was tired, and I figured, I'll just write about what I see. And I really expected that maybe 15 people would see it because it was a Saturday night. Who looks at Facebook on Saturday night? So I wrote the piece, and I hit send, and I closed the laptop, and I went out to dinner. And by the time I got home, it had been shared off my personal Facebook page, not my professional Facebook page, 18,000 times. And it just went crazy from there. And that raised the question. Reporters started calling the next day, and that raised the question for me of why. What was in that post that people found so dramatic? There were a number of things, but to be honest, it was about 700 words. It was not a tome about the realities of life in America on that day. So why did people identify with it so closely? One of the reporters who called the next day said that they estimated it had been shared 1 million times. I don't know if that was true or not, but why did it have that kind of reach? And I believe possibly for 2 reasons. The first was something that my entire career has hammered on, and that was the fact that I returned political discussions to our fundamental principles and our fundamental leaders. And what I said in that post was that shock events can be used the way Abraham Lincoln used them, to bring the country together and to create a new progressive future. And that kind of tying of our political language, not to the divisions that have transpired in America really since about 1968, when there was a famous book written by Kevin Phillips on how essentially to slice and dice the electorate. So rather than appealing to principles and to narratives, you instead appeal to left-handed typists in Duluth, actually meant that people felt that they had a stake in politics again, that their votes, what they did, would make a difference. And I think people liked seeing that Lincoln and fundamental American principles still obtained in modern day America, despite the fact that we often feel like we're ping pong balls bouncing back and forth among different arguments, different people, and not really able to be being grounded anywhere. So that was a piece of it, but I came to think that there was something else. And that was that I live in this world. I work in this world. I write for the major publications in the country, the Times, the Post, all those sorts of places. I have a foot in that world. I study politics every day. I read the news more than most of the politicians with whom I work read the news. I know that world. But I write for a popular audience. I write for people on the street. And it seemed to me that what people liked about that post was it was somebody whose foot was in our world writing in such a way that they understood it, that they felt like they had a stake in it. And that did not come to me organically. People, I guess, said to people, we're being filmed, so I won't use the actual language I used, but hey, what the heck is going on? I actually put it a little bit differently when I was not on film. And they said, who else is doing this? Who else is talking about the things you're talking about on Facebook as opposed to at the Washington Post? And interestingly enough, the Post wrote and said, will you do more of these for us? And I was like, well, what's the point of that? The audience is here. And that actually changed the way that I looked at responding because, of course, the outpouring of interest in my ideas was huge. And my first response was to write an academic response to them. I wrote about 10,000 words explaining shock events, explaining where I thought the country was, and all that sort of thing. And it was ordered, and it was exactly the sort of thing I would do for a book to be published and to end up in Barnes & Noble. And I sent it to one of my readers, and she said, boy, this is crap. And I thought, well, she's kind of right. She said, I didn't read past the first 2 paragraphs. If I wanted to read that, I would go read the New York Times. That's not what I want to read. So I sat down and rewrote the entire response to the Facebook posts. And that, I think, is what was linked from here. And that was, rather than putting it in the order that I would put it in, that I thought was important, I actually figured out what questions people were asking and answered those questions. Writing those responses in such a way that they were all under 1,000 words, I think they were about 800 words apiece, that they had a beginning and an end, including a zinger at the end, and that they all worked together as a unit, was one of the hardest things I've ever written. But it was a deliberate attempt to say, let's wrench this political discussion out of the way that people are doing it in the usual political circles and put it into the kind of language that's going to make a difference in places like Facebook, which is, after all, where most people are getting their news nowadays. So that is, in the end, why I think that shock event post went as far as it did. It was not, to my mind, necessarily brilliant or anything, but it was a new kind of language and a new kind of approach to American politics that we really haven't seen since the early 1960s. And that, except to the extent that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump used it in this last election. And that, I think, is ultimately the significance of this shock event post and of this moment, that if, in fact, we're going to reorder American politics, which is long overdue to my mind, we need to use a new kind of language and a new kind of approach. And people like us have to find that kind of language to do that. And that, I think, is why this ended up being a shock event to the historical and the academic narrative, as well as to American politics. So with that, why don't we take off?
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Heather. So I have a question about where you ended, which is this political reordering or alignment that you talk about in the first, well, in several of the posts, I think. So you're a scholar of the most significant political realignment in American history, or at least one of the most significant political realignments. And my question is, to what extent do you see a political realignment that might come out of the Trump presidency? To what extent would such a realignment require us to think about xenophobia, racism, all of the things that Homi mentioned in his introduction, as somehow being secondary to or unfortunate side effects of the genuine economic grievances that Trump supporters experience? That is, to what extent do we have to act as though xenophobia and racism are epiphenomenal?
Can I just make one procedural thing to Thank you, Steve, for putting it as one question. What we often get here is, I have a question, but let me tell you why I'm going to ask the question. We just want to have the question. Then we can go back and get the reasons for the question. The dramatic purpose of this event is lost if each one gives an introduction to the question. We just want the question. Then we'll go back to you. Thank you so much, Steve.
Well,
you wanna give the
I've had to give those instructions to people in the past, so I thought I would
Well, you've done
adhere to
very,
them.
very well. You're the master of your own instructions.
You want the question again? So, for a political realignment along the lines that you would like to see or that you envision or that you think might come out of this, to what extent do we have to act as though or think as though racism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, misogyny are epiphenomenal, are secondary, or are unfortunate side effects?
So I'm not going to answer that with a direct answer. Rather than, I'm going to give an introduction to my answer to that. I study American politics, the whole sweep of American politics. I don't just study the present. And we are at a period that looks very much like periods where we've been before. The 1850s, the 1890s, and the 1920s, we're doing it all over again. This is a moment that, if historical precedent holds, and I think it will, certainly the predictions that I have been able to make in politics have been astonishingly right, which is ever so gratifying, I have to say, suggests that we are in the middle of a major political realignment, possibly the biggest political realignment in American history, I think probably the biggest political realignment in history. And one of the tricks to those realignments is that the country becomes extraordinarily polarized over a couple of ideologies, and the people who are running the country have an ideology that no longer actually reflects reality. That's happened again and again and again. When that happens, people who are getting, screwed by that ideology wake up and say, wait a minute, this is not what we signed up for. And when that happens, they go back to basic American political principles. The trick to those basic American political principles, though, is that buried within our commitment to equality of opportunity in American history has always been racism, sexism, and xenophobia. They go hand in hand, and they were reinforced during Reconstruction as well. And that's a bit of a longer answer probably than you want on that, and I can talk about that. But the trick is to recognize that always when we get reform in American history, it has begun as economic reform, and the reforms to our racism, sexism, and xenophobia have come after that economic reform. They do go hand in hand. It is not one or the other. They are inextricable in American society. And so do we have to say that they're an unfortunate side effect? That makes it sound dismissive of those things, and yet I think that they are part and parcel of them. You cannot address the one without addressing the other, and you certainly cannot address racism, sexism, and xenophobia without addressing economic inequality, which to my mind always, always, always has come first. If you look at reforms in American history, especially reforms over race, they come when people have money. Simple answer. And they get really bad when people don't. Right now, people don't. Things are not good. So I don't think I would call it I would not necessarily call it secondary because they are inextricable, but I would say that as I look at it, until we address the truly hideous economic dislocation in America since 1980, when the path between the rich and the poor started to split, until we have now the vast majority of income, for example, going to the top less than 1%, until we address that, the rest of it is kind of, pissing into the wind.
Excellent. I'll keep my preamble very brief, and that's because I want to offer sort of another possible explanation for what's happening. And so I think there's no question that the Muslim travel ban and Trump's policies are shocking, consequential, and in many ways tragic. But I want to sort of interrogate the idea of a shock event as a sort of a technical term as you use it in the posts, and I want to, which sort of depends on the idea that this is kind of a stun grenade, a political stun grenade, right? That it distracts from the real grand design and is meant to sort of just sow chaos in the public. And I just want to submit as an alternative theory, what I'll call the sort of Matt Taibbi, Mark Fisher theory, that Trump is a sort of a scandal-generating ignoramus who feeds off public adulation, right? Has no ideological commitments, and always listens to the last person in the room during a meeting, which is something that Mark Fisher told me as a biographer of Trump, that was the case in the Trump organization. People would compete to be the last person in the room. And so Bannon may be the last person in the room often, but probably not always. And so is it possible that instead what we're seeing is that Trump saw that ethno-nationalism worked during the campaign, and he decided to double down on that with a Muslim travel ban, did a terrible job of it, right? He is quite bad at governing. And so we're going to see more of these sort of fumbles along the way, rather than a grand design that is being sort of put forth by Bannon. So I guess the question is, how do we know if you're right, or if this is sort of fits and starts of bad policy, and to what degree intentionality is important in your account, right? Does there have to be an intention by Bannon and Trump to distract people from the real project, rather than just sort of going from policy fumble to policy fumble?
So the question is this just imbecility, or is it deliberate?
Right. I mean, deliberate in some sense, but the shock that you describe is one where there is a deeper, grand design that people are trying to distract the public from by sowing chaos, right?
Yes.
As I understood it.
Yes, that's right. So what I was arguing, and I still hold to, is that there is a deliberate attempt to sow confusion in order to push a larger design. And I only alluded to that larger design at the time because I didn't want to get involved in what Bannon was up to. I had studied Bannon at great length for weird reasons, but I had very clear ideas about what he was up to, and they were not quite to fruition yet. It turned out that it looks pretty much like it was quite clear what he was doing, and it turned out later on people said exactly what I had been saying about him. And what I would suggest is that those two things are not incompatible. That is, I do think, I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I am not bound by the Goldwater rule. And I would say that Donald Trump has a problem with narcissism. And when I say a problem, I'm understating it. And one of the tricks of narcissism is the consequent dominance politics that somebody who suffers from narcissism engages in. And to that end, that is, there are several, so I did a theory of power a couple of years ago. I spent 2 years working on a theory of power for historians that nobody but historians looked at. And what I did was I spent a lot of time reading about narcissism and how narcissists garner power. And the way you do that is to destabilize people and to challenge their reality, to make sure that they never quite know what's going on. They never quite know what is real. They never quite know what the actual facts are. And once you start to destabilize their experience of their reality, it makes it much easier to step in and say, trust me. I can take care of this for you. I can make the world look good again. And the reason things seem off to you is not because I'm bad. It's because of that guy over there. And who that guy is doesn't really matter. And I think Trump does that on a personal level, but Eric Hoffer identified that in 1951 as a technique that authoritarians used as well, either political or religious authoritarians. And it seems to me that every step of the way you can see Trump doing these very actions. So I think on a personal level for him, that's what he's up to. But that kind of mentality runs in tandem to the ideas of people like Bannon. And that is that I think that Bannon, Trump, certainly Kellyanne Conway, and many of the people in Trump's circle, and I think you can include here Flynn, you can include all the people in the circle, Tillerson, all the people in the circle, believe in a world in which a few wealthy, usually white men should rule everybody else, that they don't actually believe in democracy, that they are engaged in a fight to the death to undermine democracy and to get rid of the idea that individuals actually should have equality of opportunity and actually are equal and should be equal before the law. They truly think they're better than the rest of us. The rules don't apply to them. And there is an odd paternalism in that if in fact we can just take the world back to the way it used to be, with women and minorities in their place, we will be able to return the world to this wonderful society that exists in their minds. And their enemy, of course, is Islam. And it is never really defined. It's the other. And those two things, is it deliberate when Trump tweets, unfortunately, in the early morning hours? No, I think the man's off his rocker. But it fits very nicely, that sort of dominance politics on his individual pathology fits very nicely with the societal desire to destabilize those of us who sit there and say, well, wait a minute, maybe the travel ban isn't so bad, because all of a sudden you don't quite know where the ground is under you. So I think the two go hand in hand, and the long-term gain or long-term game is not simply a war with Islam, but it is to destroy American democracy. And I firmly believe that, and it worries me very much. On the other hand, I like that we're standing up to fight for it.
Great. Thank you for being here, first of all, and thank you for writing your post, which I think just expertly diagnosed the moment that we're in. But what I appreciated most was your effort to lay out a productive way forward. And so some of the advice that you give in your posts are keep your eye on the ball and affirm at every turn that we're a land of principles and laws, stay informed, protest anything and everything that does not reflect core American principles. And it's that last one that I'm struggling with. For one, because it sounds like a recipe for exhaustion, and maybe that's the master plan, but I think more critically, it just leaves me puzzling over where's the dividing line between policy disagreements that are simply part of our party politics and something that's more fundamental and threatening. Because the reality is that there's a Republican in the Oval Office, so it's no surprise that we'll see changes in judicial nominees, in the Justice Department's approach to voting rights, environmental issues, and the list goes on. And even if Trump's opponents were to have their wildest dreams come true and he were to resign in disgrace, we would still probably have these policies in place, but now pursued by a President Pence. And so is that the anything and everything that we should be protesting, or is that just kind of run-of-the-mill party politics? And the first set of examples, like in some ways innocuous, but if you take something like the Muslim ban, is that an affront to our principles, or is it a partisan issue? Or the attempt to repeal the ACA, or hints at fundamental changes to entitlement programs? Just how do you think about identifying that dividing line, and how do we know when we should be protesting the actions of Trump and or Pence, and when and what we protest?
That's a great question, and I would suggest that in this case, you do need the backstory of where I come from politically, and that is that I firmly believe that most Americans are agreed on things that we want. We want an activist government that protects equality of opportunity. And even on issues I think I said it in those posts, even on issues that theoretically are hot button issues like abortion, only 15% of Americans actually want abortion outlawed in all circumstances. Most Americans agree, I believe, most Americans agree on the existence of the New Deal state, which is the liberal consensus, if you will, from the 1950s, the idea that the government does have a responsibility to protect equality of opportunity and to regulate business, protect workers, and to provide a basic social safety net, as well as providing infrastructure. And that was an ideology that, of course, was originally embraced by Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, and then got picked up again by Grover Cleveland, which no one cares about. But then it got picked up again by Teddy Roosevelt, and finally got put into permanent, well, at least a seemingly permanent policy by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But then, after FDR picked it up, it left the Republicans in a real bind, because they had been arguing that the government should do absolutely nothing. And in fact, they had often pointed back to even the years before the Civil War as their hallmark of America's greatness. And the Republican Party split at that point, and one group went down that road saying that the government should in fact erase the New Deal, but the other set of Republicans, led by Dewey, of course, and also by some guy who did something important, Eisenhower, who won World War II, said that in fact the Republicans wanted the same things that the Democrats did, they just wanted a little bit more emphasis on business. And Eisenhower was actually a brilliant man. I've read his papers. He gets far too little credit. But most Americans believed in that. They liked that system, and I believe they still do. So I'm suggesting, when I say stand up for American principles, I'm saying fundamentally stand up for the rights and responsibilities of senators, of congressmen, of the president. What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to release their taxes. And I mean not just the laws, but I also mean the traditions as well. And I think if we actually got back to a government that functioned, so that you did not have the problem of the movement conservatives who believe the government should in fact go back to the 1850s or the 1920s, as they say now, which is in fact in their literature. That most Americans don't actually want that. They voted for it because we have become so extraordinarily tribal, but most Americans don't want that. And if we could get back to basics and erase those guys, the Freedom Caucus, we would in fact end up with a much more functional American society. And tomorrow's vote on the AHCA is a great example of that, and this is why I think we're at such a crisis moment, certainly for the Republican Party, but also for the country, and that is that for all the fact that the Freedom Caucus and Paul Ryan insists that they have a mandate to destroy Obamacare, in fact, most Americans like Obamacare. A majority like it, and many people like its policies without knowing that that's what they like. If we could get back to a Congress that actually worked, then we could start arguing about the details, but most of us agree with the idea that the government has certain basic responsibilities to Americans, and we could actually move forward again. So when I talk about protesting, there's always going to be people who protest different policies, and certainly, for example, I have an opinion about whether Gorsuch belongs on the Supreme Court. I am protesting Gorsuch on the Supreme Court not because of his positions, which I don't agree with, but because I think we have a crisis moment right now in that we've got a nominee for the Supreme Court who has been nominated by a man whose legitimacy to the presidency is currently under investigation by the FBI. This is unprecedented. If I could wave my magic wand, I would have all Americans say, hold it. We can't consider him until we know that his nomination was legitimate. And so I'm opposing that, but for a very different reason than his policies. Now, if we could all agree on that, then I might be willing to go protest his policies. But until we figure out the legitimacy of that nomination, I'm not willing to argue about policy yet.
Okay, well, thank you, Heather. This is such a rich set of questions, it's hard to know how to single out one. But as one of the two historians on the panel, I thought I'd be safe going back to the 1950s. I figured nobody else would do that. When I think of shock events, I'm reminded of Joseph McCarthy and the technique of the multiple lie, that you keep continuing morning and afternoon of every day to issue a new pronouncement without anything beneath it, so that you're constantly ahead of your critics who are bewildered in the way you describe. After the McCarthy phenomenon had flamed out, several brilliant social scientists, including Daniel Bell, Richard Hofstadter, Seymour Martin Lipset, gathered to try to make sense of this and tried to trace it back to what the Frankfurt School had identified as the authoritarian personality, and came up with a very elaborate explanation for this kind of radical right-wing extremism. About a decade later, a political scientist named Michael Rogan explained that McCarthy's roots actually lay in traditional Republican conservative politics, and if you traced his electorate, you saw nothing exceptional in it. So my question is this really something dramatically different, or is it instead simply a more boorish and bombastic version of traditional conservative Republican politics?
There's two ways to answer that. The first is the New Deal was a game changer. When I did the Republican book, I don't think you can look at traditional Republican politics in the same way after the New Deal, because traditional Republican politics had been put into full exercise in the 1920s. Exactly what they've been saying since the days of the Civil War. What happens is the Republicans control the American government beginning in the Republican Party is formed in 1854 to 1856. They take the White House in 1861 with Abraham Lincoln, and the Southerners all leave, so they have a majority in the government, and they create our first activist government. It fields the armies and the Navy, and it creates national colleges, and it puts people on homesteads, it creates a Union Pacific Railroad, and for the first time in American history, it puts national taxes on people, including the income tax. That's actually invented by the Republicans, not by the Democrats. But the Republicans lose power in Congress they lose the 1874 elections in the House. So in 1875, the Republicans lose control of the government, entire control of the government, and they only regain it very briefly in 1889 to 1891. And so they don't really have power again to do whatever they want until the 1920s. The 1920 election is a landslide election for Harding, and it gives the Republicans control of the government for the first time. And when that happens, for the first time since the Civil War era. And when that happens, the Republicans are able to put in power entirely their vision, their 1890 vision of the fact that the government should do nothing but help big business and protect liberty. And it works. To all intents and purposes, it works. The 1920s look terrific. You've got radio, you've got nylons coming in, you've got people with tons of money. Everything looks great. The stock market takes off, and the Republicans claim every bit of the credit for it. And they say, see, we told you Democrats were weenies and had no idea how to run the country. We have figured out how to make business and government work together perfectly. This is just the best. Well, they would have said this is just ducky, which is the term for the time. Of course, the reality was that it was a facade, that the economy was falling apart below the surface. Farmers were in terrible trouble in the 1920s. Workers were in terrible trouble. And what happened is that by tying themselves so thoroughly to that, the Republicans went down in flames when the economy burst. And with that, traditional, if you will, Republican ideology is revealed as being a huge smokescreen. And after the 1920s, once you get to the 1930s, I don't think that the traditional 1890s Republicanism really has any legitimacy anymore to anybody who is seriously looking at the economy. So I would see a break there between the old traditional Republican ideology, although of course people are now talking about tariffs again the same way that people did in the 1890s and the 1880s. But as far as McCarthy, so there goes the traditional Republicans out the window, but I would say something different about McCarthy, and I would say something different about this particular moment that comes out of the New Deal, and that is that, as I said, the Republican Party splits in the 1930s. They either decide that, in fact, Hoover was right, the 1920s were fine, except for the fact, as one man testifies before the House, that the problem was that school teachers and other public servants took too much money during the 1920s, and that's why the economy collapsed. It was not Wall Street, it was the public sector, because taxes were too high. You either took that route or you took the other one, which is the one that Eisenhower and Dewey took, and said, basically, we've got to have the government intervening in a modern industrial economy because it turns out the world really has changed since the last century, and we have to find some way for the government to manage capitalism in such a way that it works effectively, or in this moment, we're going to lose the capitalist system, and we're going to become a world of socialists and communists, and we don't want that either. And those Republicans dominate the party, but they have the problem of the fact that that rump group that comes out of the Hoover side of the party, and it quite literally does, it follows from Hoover to a man who worked with him, Senator Robert Taft, for whom there is still an office building named in Washington, who was the son of William Howard Taft. And he was from Ohio. He was a very provincial man in a lot of ways. He believed that what the country really needed to do was to erase the New Deal. And this is where we get the concept of the Me Too Republicans, because they were the ones who were willing to parrot the New Deal, he said, and they kept losing elections because they were simply the Me Too Republicans. And Taft gets real ideological power in 1951. McCarthy starts his thing in 1950. You hear about it in 53 and 54, of course, but he speaks up for the first time in 50 when he's attacking the Truman presidency. And in 1951, we get an incredibly important document in American history, and it's written by William F. Buckley, Jr. It's called God and Man at Yale. And in that book, which is a very sophomoric book, but in that book, what he argues is that, and this is very important, that what America really needs to do is to turn away from the Enlightenment, to turn back to a world in which we accept as one of the a version of the Ten Commandments, if you will, the idea that the government has no role in American society except to protect liberty and to protect Christianity, Catholicism in his case. Those should be fundamentals. They should never be tampered with. And the problem with the Enlightenment is if, in fact, you accept the Enlightenment idea that people should make arguments and based in facts, and that people will naturally choose the better of those arguments, is clearly misproven by the fact that Americans have adopted, in this case, the New Deal, because Eisenhower's not in office yet, creating his own middle way based on the New Deal. The fact that people have supported the New Deal suggests that the Enlightenment, in fact, is wrong. So you can't actually make an argument about returning the world to the 1920s because people won't buy it. You need to do something else, and that is to create a narrative to indoctrinate people to follow those rules and to follow those fundamental rules. And he lays it out quite demonstrably in God and Man in Yale, in which he cherry picks evidence from his days at Yale to suggest that his professors there are pushing socialism, pushing communism, that they are not talking about individualism. This is in 1951, and then Eisenhower is elected in 52, and in 53 starts putting his middle way, as he calls it, into place. And with that, Buckley and at that point his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, begin to back McCarthy and McCarthyism. And what McCarthy does is he takes those rather intellectual ideas and he brings them down to the grassroots level and he bullies people. He uses that cherry-picked smearing of individuals, and he proves that that works. And that authoritarian personality, if you will, I actually think for McCarthy, and for Buckley certainly, and Bozell, it really, and then I'm sorry, I think for them it's more of an intellectual and a political movement. Shortly after that, of course, you get the fact that Bozell and Buckley write McCarthy and His Enemies, which is what gives us the idea of liberals, capital L, and conservatives, capital C. The idea that the world is in fact divided in two, and the bad guys are the liberals, but they are all Americans who believe in that liberal consensus, the New Deal or the American way. And that sort of reactionary, we're going to get rid of the Enlightenment, we're going to move away from argument and move simply into a language of lies, a language of bullying, a language of authoritarianism, I don't think had anything to do with the earlier Republicans. You might not like J.D. Rockefeller, you might not like Andrew Carnegie, you might not like what they're talking about, but they truly believed in their ideas and they were willing to argue those ideas. By the time you get to McCarthy, to Goldwater, to the people who followed in Goldwater's wake, Reagan, for example, those are people who are no longer dealing with arguments, they're dealing with cartoon cutouts of arguments that are deliberate lies. And that's not traditional Republicanism, and it's not traditional American politics, and it's not the Enlightenment. And that, I think, is a really new moment in American history, and we're watching it play out, the final stage of it, at least I hope the final stage of it, right now.
Like everyone else, I think, on the panel, in fact, everyone else in this room, I've enormously appreciated the historical depth you've been able to bring to this. I'd like to perhaps expand the scope a little bit. My introductory point, extremely brief, is an observation by Karl Marx, one of his most perceptive observations, I think, which is countries with strong constitutional orders are the countries that have revolutions. He was talking about France, but I think he also probably had in mind the United States, which of course he was very interested in. And the question I want to put to you is really related to that observation. You say that the way we should go is to cling to the principles, at least, of the Constitution. I think we can't really disagree with that. But if we cling to the Constitution itself, it seems to be a slightly more problematic matter. On one reading of the story, we have Trump precisely because of an oddity of the Constitution, namely the Electoral College. And I think quite a lot of Trump's electorate, which was also Bernie's electorate, as you've observed, have a feeling of powerlessness, partly again because of the constitutional structures that organize politics in this country, most obviously the Supreme Court. So an enormous range of important topics are simply off the agenda or may seem to be controlled by a cultural elite, but not political process. So the question I want to put to you is, when you say clinging to the Constitution or turn to the Constitution, isn't the Constitution itself, in fact, one of the problems, and that we are facing one of Marx's revolutionary moments because of that?
Well, I just want to remind people, first of all, that Karl Marx was a keen observer of America. He actually reported the American Civil War, which is not coincidental in this. But the question about the Constitution is a very interesting one, because we've got, to my mind, there are a number of historical precedents and a number of things that apply to the moment. And the more interesting one I'll get to in a second. But I would suggest that a big problem right now is gerrymandering. The big problem right now is gerrymandering. And that's the process of politicians picking their own voters rather than the other way around. And that, I think, has done two things to us. One, it has made people feel like they're not in power. In fact, we had only 12 House seats that were truly contested in the last election. But it also puts a premium on people becoming more radical rather than less, because you don't worry about being too moderate, you worry about being primaried. And you heard that this week when President Trump threatened Republicans who were not going to vote for his AHCA with being primaried, with getting somebody more radical rather than less radical in that seat. So the Constitution's problem right now, it seems to me, is gerrymandering. If we want a magic bullet, we want to fix gerrymandering, and I don't think that is far-fetched, first of all. So the other problem, though, about where we are right now politically is there's two pieces. One is, I guess this is probably the more important of the two, and one is that we are at an extreme moment in American politics, and we are here because we have a party in power that is not supported by the majority of the American people. Whether you want to count it by the number of votes that the other candidates, not just Secretary of State Clinton, but also Jill Stein and Johnson, whose first name is escaping me. Gary Johnson got. The president in power does not have a majority of the popular vote. And that's happened before in American history. It's happened 4 times in American history, but most recently it's happened twice in the last, 20 years? This is a problem. This is a problem that must be addressed, because what it means is that our systems no longer have legitimacy. And that right there is a problem. And that would be helped in part by gerrymandering, but it would also be by getting rid of gerrymandering. It would also be helped by getting rid of the voter suppression laws, the voter restriction laws that are taking place in a number of different states. But the reason that is significant, I think, on a larger political scale is not simply because of a crisis in the American constitutional system, but also because of what it does to American political parties. And that is that as the Republican Party, which is the party that's doing it right now, the Democrats have done it on different occasions, as they have increasingly picked their electorate and controlled the government by picking their electorate, they have become more and more extreme. And the problem with that is, as they have become more, for a political party, is as they have become more and more extreme, they are infuriating more and more people. And I think this vote tomorrow is a huge moment in American politics, because the rubber is meeting the road tomorrow over the AHCA. But as they have done that, what they are going to do finally is get enough people upset that there is going to be an extraordinary backlash, and that's going to swing us just as far in the other direction. And the reason I say that is this is not a new moment in American history where you have the very problem you're talking about. And I don't want to go in too much detail on how this played out, but in the 1880s, the Republicans had the exact same problem that they've got now. They wanted a pro-business government. They believed the government should do nothing but protect people at the top, that would trickle down to others, and that if you tried to protect people at the bottom, you would encourage them to be lazy, to depend on others, to look for somebody to take care of them. The ideology of the 1880s and the 1890s on the Republican side is very much what it is nowadays, and it's also very much what things looked like among the Democrats in the 1850s. And I'll let that sink in for a second. But because most Americans, in fact, did not want to be living in a world in which the government and the military at that point actively worked in favor of business, the Republicans had to jerry-rig the system. And what they did is they gave us, among other things, 6 new states in the space of a year in 1889 to 1890. Somebody's looking shocked here. Yes, you ever thought about that? We got the 13 colonial states all at once. And then we got North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Washington between 1889 and 1890 in 12 months. And the idea was that they would all vote Republican. Montana didn't play the game. It voted Democratic, and the Republicans declared the people sitting in Montana from Congress had been elected illegally, so they replaced them all with Republicans. And the idea was quite deliberately to stack the Electoral College and to stack the Senate. They also restricted the vote dramatically across the country. And they got more extreme with that. In 1892 and 1894 and 1896. And the problem with that, of course, was that once that dam broke for the Republican Party was crushed. Or that branch of the Republican Party was crushed with the Progressive era, beginning in, with Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. There, of course, was another problem there that I'd rather not have on tape, because I don't think it should be broadcast. But is it a constitutional crisis then, or is it a political crisis? I would argue that the Constitution, which is, by the way, overdue for amendments, we haven't had a constitutional amendment in a very long time, and there will be some probably coming out of this era. The Constitution is not the problem, I think, so much as adapting the Constitution to the modern era and fixing the political system, because right now the divorce between the American political system and the concept of representation is so extraordinary that the very legitimacy of our government is currently in question, and that is not a sustainable system. Is it a question of fixing the Constitution? Possibly in the end. We need a better system for getting rid of a discrepancy between the popular vote and a president. Or is it a system of politics? I think we need to fix the politics first before we can take on the Constitution. Ultimately, I have faith in the American Constitution because I think it speaks for the concept that every human being should have self-determination. And that, I think, to my mind, is the fundamental principle of being a human. So I have faith in it. It might need a little tweaking, but I think our problem right now is political and not constitutional.
Thank you very much. You really have opened up a lot of very interesting questions and have given us a long historical perspective for which I certainly am most grateful. I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'm going to go back to the panel to see if they want to come back to each other or to yourself. But my question is, you put this moment in a very useful historical context. And the narrative, thank you. And the narrative is clearly detailed and deep. But why has this election been experienced with the kind of shock and horror that it has? Why is the affective feeling of it so different from anything that I have ever experienced? If I were in India now, maybe my experience would not be, and we'll hear from a colleague of ours, Shugata Bose, in a minute about what's happening in India. But why has this, why is the impact of this so different? Why do people feel so psychically disoriented? And does it help to point to analogs to deal with that kind of affective political response? That's one. My other question is, how do we think of these small majorities or small, what are they? I mean, are they really just divisions, or is there something, as I said in my introduction, something more unsettling about them? These, they're not just simply divisions that go around one line or the other, one political position or the other. These are the two questions I'd be grateful to hear.
Well, I think we're unsettled because we believed that there was a world that we could trust, that we had, as I say, a New Deal government, and we didn't like necessarily on one side or the other the way that government behaved, but you had faith that the State Department was going to show up to a meeting. You had faith that the wheels were going to keep turning, that if you applied for a passport, you'd get one, that you could get on a plane and go somewhere and come back. And to have those things ripped apart and to not know, to have a president who was the American president, the most powerful figure in the world, randomly tweeting at 6 o'clock in the morning is scary. You know, I don't know about the rest of you. I get up every morning and I spend way too much time in my bed reading my phone, thinking, you know, what happened last night that I didn't hear about? And I've never done that before. And I think it's partly the fact that our world has collapsed. The structures that we trusted are gone. And I'm not entirely sure. I think in the short term, it's a terrible thing. I think we have walked away from the world stage. I don't think we're going to get back the territory we've lost in just the last 2 months. And I just find that stunning and heartbreaking that more people aren't reacting to that. But the rest of it, in a way, is the positive side of an event like this. We have it in our power to rebuild the government we want and the country we want, really from the ground up. And to have so much on the table and to have people saying, wait, I wanted health care. You know, I actually think it's probably a good idea to have PBS. And wait a minute, the science, wait a minute, I want to have satellites. You know, I think that there is positive to come out of this as well, but I think we are uneasy because we don't know what's coming next. And that's, for all that many of us have fought about politics for our entire adult lives, I trusted that the State Department was going to go to meetings, you know? And the fact that I could even sit here and say that that's no longer happening is just mind-boggling. You know, I trusted that the president would, you know, release his taxes and I could complain about them. And that's not happening. You know, I trusted that the government would not have to investigate my president for, and this is the elephant in the room, collaborating with a foreign power to take down democracy. These are not things that I was in any way prepared for. I was ready to go out and fight about, you know, whether or not we were going to fund this or fund that, or I was ready to fight on the edges. I never thought I would be fighting for democracy. And this, I think, is what we're doing, and that makes a lot of us really, really uneasy. So in terms of where are we truly divided between a red country and a left and a blue country, as you're saying? I don't believe so. I truly do not believe so. I think this is the authoritarian mindset. I think this is the narrative that says we're the good guys and the left is just as guilty of this as the right. We're just not, the left is just not in power in any meaningful fashion, except in enclaves like this. I don't think there's the good guys and the bad guys. You know, and I travel in a lot of worlds, and I'll tell you, the jerks are pretty evenly distributed. And the good people are pretty evenly distributed. But when I talk to people, I had a fascinating conversation the other day with somebody about guns. And, you know, women in the public sphere get death threats. That's a given. Many men don't know that. We do. And I was a little frightened. And I said to a neighbor of mine, do you have guns? And he said, oh, I'm a Second Amendment NRA supporter. Of course I've got guns. He said, I'm not like you snowflake liberals. And I said, yeah? What do you got? And he said, well, I got 4 guns. I got a shotgun. That's the one I usually use. And I probably have an old handgun around here or something. And I said, wait a minute. So what you're saying is you have the same guns I have, because I'm a snowflake liberal who has a snowflake friend who gave me 4 beautiful shotguns, antique shotguns, and they're in my house. I don't think of myself as a gun owner, but I actually own guns. And I said, but do you have like one of those assault weapons? And he goes, well, no, I wouldn't have an assault weapon. Those are just stupid. Like, those kill a lot of people. And I said, so you actually don't have assault weapons, just like I don't have assault weapons. And he goes, you know, and those expletives who carry guns out in public, they're just expletives. And I thought, and I actually said, so you and I agree on this 100%, but you bill yourself as a Second Amendment, right-wing, you know, Trump supporter, and I bill myself as a reasonable liberal, you know, and we started to argue down those lines, and in fact, we came out pretty much the same the whole way down the line, and I bet we have never voted the same way. And all I'm suggesting is at this moment, rather than identifying as part of a tribe, which so many of us do, we actually look and say, well, what does the Second Amendment mean to us? What does abortion mean to us? What do those things really mean to us? Because I would not only lay money, but I would obviously lay my career and probably my life on the idea that most of us really in America do agree. Not all of us, but most of us could sit in the room and argue together and come out in a pretty good place, I think, although I've been accused of being a Pollyanna.
So you think we Americans exist, this we-ness exists?
I absolutely think the we-ness exists. I think it does not exist among politicians because they make a profit off of making sure it doesn't exist. If we could get back together and take the system back, I think we'd have a much better country.
Thank you. Comments from the panel?
So I worry that we are underestimating how much race and gender bear on the potential and the bases for realignment and for coming together. And so, I mean, I definitely take your point that, you know, sentiments around race and gender are obviously manipulated by self-interested politicians who exploit these divisions to limit the opposition to their policy goals. But I think the receptivity to these, to certain narratives, and some of them narratives that you describe in your posts, I don't think that receptivity can be ignored or minimized. And I mean, I really feel like what's happening is that they tap into some pretty deeply held resentments about civil rights, women's rights, about immigration, and the belief that, you know, white Americans in general and white American men in particular properly belong at the center of American social, economic, and cultural life. And, you know, it's not just that Democrats and Republicans bicker over the narrative of white disadvantage that contributes to making these ideas persist. I think it's also because people really believe them and they don't want to bother to hold them up to the light and scrutinize them. And getting people to put those differences aside, that just seems, yeah, it just seems easier said than done. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine how to get there, and yet I really do think it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, I just don't think there can be a durable realignment of the type that you're hoping for without addressing that head on.
Should we take another?
Sure.
And then you could.
Sure. So I was going to actually echo Claudine's sentiments. I do some research on people's beliefs about kind of what the nation means, and over half of Americans don't believe that a true American is someone who is not Christian, who doesn't have American ancestry, who was not born in the U.S. And it's a large portion of the population. So I think that's a major hurdle. But I think the other thing that you mentioned is the importance of elite polarization between the parties. I would add to that partisan identification has grown in importance, and the sorting of issues into party camps has become more and more important. So that seems to stand in tension with the sort of the newness of the Trump phenomenon to some degree. So I wonder whether we can think about the barrier that racism plays, but also the barrier that longstanding Republican strategies play, right? Obstruction, vilification of Obama based on racial terms, right? Refusal to stand up against Trump now, but also the takeover of state legislatures and disenfranchisement, voter disenfranchisement, as you mentioned, right? These are mighty hurdles ahead of us, right? Even though it's true that on policies, the population is generally in the middle. But when it comes to issues of race, of national membership, there are strong cleavages, and then we've got this massive party polarization that seems to kind of resist the idea of a hopeful Lincoln-esque kind of message that you advocate.
So Heather, how do we rebuild the we on that basis?
Well, that is the project in which I've been engaged and hope to continue to be engaged and hope to get more people to engage. Mm-hmm. And that is that I think you're absolutely right in this moment. We don't have to be here. You know, the one thing that historians, that I would keep arguing about history, and it's worth actually pointing out that I'm an idealist not in the ooey and aye sense, but in the idea that I believe ideas matter and ideas can be changed. But it has always been a huge problem for me that it seemed to me that people who think, as we are discussing here, walked away from the narrative table. You know, while we were sitting here worrying about specifics, worrying about the nitty-gritty of how things worked, the political narrative in America got taken over by the Bill O'Reillys of the world. And I want to take it back. You know, I always think of that picture, the very famous picture of Superman in the 1950s that said, you know, this America's about people from every country and every race, and if anybody ever says anything different, they're un-American and they don't belong here. Okay, that was before my time, but not by much. We could do that again. And I guess for me there's a larger piece too, and it's not that we could do that again. We must do that again. Because I truly believe that American democracy is on the line. And I truly believe that you're exactly right, that there is an ideological narrative and an ideological group of people who are deliberately trying to destroy it. And they have put forward a very believable narrative. It's a great narrative. I mean, frankly, if you think about the narrative that the movement conservatives who took over the Republican Party have sold, that individuals are against this behemoth government that is destroying them, to have this sort of bureaucracy that is going to rule everything and ruin the world, that's not only a huge mythological symbol, but that's Star Wars. You know, that, I mean, that really has extraordinarily mythological potential. And it's really easy to believe. And they really, I think, have taken the narrative structure, have taken the narrative of American society and have perverted it in a way that looks very much like the 1890s did and like the 1850s did. I think we're in a moment that looks very much like the 1850s. The narrative that we are living looks very much like that of the Southern Democratic slaveholders. And yet we changed that narrative. We changed that narrative in the 1860s and we carried it into the 1870s. And then that reared its head again, and we've been fighting it ever since. But do I think there's a magic bullet other than gerrymandering right now? No. I think the way that we combat it, though, is by taking it on, by telling a story of an America in which people really do have equality of opportunity. People really do have to stand equal before the law. So, for example, I forget the gentleman's name, but when the guy whose back was broken by the police in last year, does anyone remember his name? It wasn't Eric Garner? Was it Eric Garner? Okay. It was Garner?
No, in Baltimore, it would be Freddie Gray?
Yes,
Yeah.
Freddie Gray. I have a neighbor who's a very right-wing, and he said, well, you know, this is all the fault of the Democrats. They're the ones. And I said, a man's back was broken in police custody. Yeah, but it's because they're not working. I said, a man was broken in police custody. I don't care what that man did. Do you really want to live in a country where the police can break someone's back while that person is in custody? Well, no, I guess. And I think we can insist on basic American norms and put those norms back into the public sphere in places like Facebook, where people say, yeah, I don't really want to have a world where we can't have immigrant families coming over. But I think it behooves people like us to get engaged and not simply to bemoan sexism, racism, people turning against immigrants and Muslims and whomever they're turning against, but actually to say, it's not that I care so much about the fact you're a jerk, it's because, or that it hurts me, that your sexism hurts me, but because that's not what democracy is about. And I care about democracy, and if you care about democracy, you need to stand with me on these topics. And that, you know, I think that's how you change ideas, is by changing the narrative. And on that, I'm on the same page, apparently, as Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. So the one institution you've talked about has been Facebook or individual conversations that you've had. I'm just interested, hand over a minute. I'm just interested in the other mediations, the other mediating institutions, education, the courts, the police, the profiling, etc. How do we, we've got to get our hands on all that stuff. We just can't do it through Facebook and one-on-one conversations, and I just wanted to know what.
Sure. I mean, I want to make a similar point, which is you just talked about we changed the narrative in the 1850s. We did a hell of a lot more. We changed the whole country using violence, right? And that was what I had in one of the things I had in mind when I talked about the revolutionary moment that has to break constitutional structures because they can't be changed easily in any other way. I mean, I have no confidence whatsoever there's going to be any constitutional amendment in what's left of my lifetime, or my children's lifetime. To be honest, I think it's now virtually impossible in this country for a variety of reasons, and I think that's a major problem because democracy does require, I think, not merely recognition of equality, but recognition of a degree of the possibility of collective power. And after all, the way the Constitution has been working for a very long time, it represents an obstacle in the way of people straightforwardly achieving political goals. And it produces the sort of resentment about feelings of powerlessness and so on in the face of a cultural elite, is the point I made. I mean, the people, fine with us. We can go and talk to members of the Supreme Court, I mean, we actually can feel that we have some sort of role in the governing structures of the United States. That is not true for the electorate that first Bernie and then Trump appealed to, right? I think it's very hard for us to get our head around that. And I am much more pessimistic. I mean, you said you're accused of being a Pollyanna. I'm pessimistic. I can't see, and I take it this is the hint behind Homie's remarks too, I can't actually see what the mechanism here is going to be. I can't see that we fix politics. You said fix politics first and then we'll fix the Constitution. We can't fix politics unless we fix the Constitution. We can't fix the Constitution unless we fix politics. That's the problem we're in, and traditionally that sort of thing has led to violence.
Jim, sorry, before you go, I just want to ask Jim to come in here. Jim, has the revolution happened, or is it about to happen? Are we in the midst of the revolution? As a historian,
I think the point.
responding to Heather, how do you?
Yeah, I think the point Richard makes is a very powerful one, and I think that the persistence. I mean, Heather, in your response to Steve's first question, you pointed to the existence of white male supremacist xenophobia at the core of American democracy. And that book that Homie mentioned when he so kindly introduced me is a 900-page meditation on the battle between those principles that I believe in as fervently as you do, and the resistance that is just as deep-seated in American culture and American history. And I don't believe that that rump, as you called it, is going away. I think that from their perspective, from the perspective of Goldwater, Reagan, I'd say George W. Bush, and Trump, and the majority in the current Congress, it's Eisenhower who is the outlier, and they are the true soul of the Republican Party. So I believe that this is a really serious struggle, and I hope to God that you continue to be a good prognosticator and that this is the death throes for that part of the Republican Party, because I would very much love to see it go away. But I think Richard's point is very well taken. The only moment at which it really suffered a serious defeat before the New Deal was the Civil War, and that, one could argue, lasted less than 2 decades because the rollback of Reconstruction was almost complete with the imposition of Jim Crow. So I'm not as pessimistic as Richard, not as optimistic as you are, but I think this question of where the levers are for us right now is a live question. It's very hard to identify.
Do you want to say something before Heather comes?
I just was thinking about, I saw an interview with George Will recently, and George Will has been quite outspoken in his loathing of Donald Trump. But the interviewer asked him, well, do you think that the Republican Party, he's now left the Republican Party, but he says, do you think that the Republican Party bears some of the responsibility for Trump? And he said, oh no, Trump's an anomaly, So it seems to me, speaking of institutions, that for anything to happen along the lines you're talking about, the Republican Party has to have a reckoning with its own history since 1964, or at least since the Southern Strategy and Nixon, certainly since Reagan, and we're now seeing this rehabilitation of George W. Bush, which seems to me to be part and parcel of trying to have it all ways. We can isolate Donald Trump as being this anomaly, right, and we have nothing to do with him. Well, no, they have a lot to do with him. And even John McCain, who's now a maverick again or something, he gave us Sarah Palin, and we can't forget that.
So, come back to you, and then I want to open up.
So fundamentally, there is a lever, and it's called voters. And I'm arguing that you can reach voters with a new narrative, because most Americans, in fact, don't want what the movement conservatives have sold. And this is one of the reasons I think tomorrow's vote is so important, because the movement conservatives, since Buckley at least, have been able to blame their problems on what they called capital L liberals. I'm sorry, blame problems of America on what they called capital L liberals, which is people who wanted to use the federal government to regulate business, to promote social welfare, to create infrastructure. And the argument they used came straight out of Reconstruction, which was that white tax dollars helped lazy black people. And it got expanded under Nixon to include feminists, feminazis, by the time Rush Limbaugh got his hand on them. But the reality is that that narrative does not reflect modern American society, which in fact since 1980 has dramatically funneled wealth upward, and the vast majority of Americans are not doing as well now as they used to be. One of the things that is interesting to me about Trump being elected and being nominated and elected, and of course the power of Bernie Sanders, although that's a different story because there was never Oppo research published on him. But certainly of Trump, is that many people elected Trump not because they loved Trump at all, but because it seemed to them that he would disrupt neoliberalism, that he would get rid of both parties. They said, we don't want Democrats, we don't want Republicans, we want to stop this whole system the way it's going. And those voters, I think, are very reachable. Now, the question of how to reach them, well, Facebook is obviously a start, but it's not the whole start. I'm going to be dramatic here and suggest that there is a role to be played here by scholars, and that is to focus on teaching, high school teaching and grade school teaching, and to focus on American principles of equality before the law, of what the different houses do, of what the Senate does, what the president does, and old-fashioned civics classes. And it fascinated me the other day, I saw a colleague of mine who teaches constitutional history saying, you know what I think we should do? I think we should have public meetings where we talk about like the government and how it works. Does anyone think this is a good idea? And I thought, yeah, it's called high school. like how did we miss this tick here? And I would suggest that the schools could be doing a lot more, that we could be doing a lot more with schools. That's a good place to reach people. Popular media, of course. And writing books for popular people, doing television, doing Facebook, doing Instagram, doing all the places where the media currently is one thing. The other thing I would say about our moment and whether or not we're in trouble, one of the things that began happening in 1980 and has taken off dramatically in this last election is the gender gap in voting. American women are involved in the political process today in an extraordinarily different way than they ever have been before. And I think that women's involvement in American politics, voting for issues that matter to women, mobilized in part by child care issues, in part by the glass ceiling, in part by the fact that we're still not paid as much as men are, in part by issues of abortion, means that the political power is going to shift dramatically. And that is, unless women continue to be disfranchised, as they have been in places like Texas over some weird voting laws, that's going to make a huge difference in the way things happen in the future. And one of the things, again, that I would love to see more of is people like us working more with politicians, because the rubber really does meet the road every 2 years. And how that rubber meets the road can be reworked every 2 years. Now, obviously, every 10 years when we redistrict makes a huge difference. But even the fact that so many people are now getting actively involved in the actions of their representatives, that is unprecedented. And they're not the same as the Tea Partiers were during the Obama years. They are people who have substantive concerns. They remind me a great deal, actually, of the populists in the 1890 election, where people really didn't take them seriously, and in fact, they did have the keys to the future of the country. So, I walk on a knife edge every other day. I think we're headed for a progressive era in America. I will say that that being on a knife edge really is a reflection of the fact that I do think it is worth paying attention, because I do think that this is a question of the survival of American democracy, the same way it was in 1860, and that sitting back and saying we're screwed is not a legitimate response to this moment.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you all. Thank you very much. There. Can we have a show of hands? Questions? Yes, please.
I'm from Ohio, which is ground zero of a lot of the issues that have been discussed up here already. Gerrymandering, the discrepancy, the gap between rich, poor, and the distribution of income, and all of those things. And at the same time, I also see the Trump presidency as a somewhat of an anomaly in the historic progression. I think he stands as almost one of a kind in our historical experience. On the other hand, I came across another theory about what's been happening, and that is that basically every 8 years, the American public simply says, let's try somebody different. And there's a couple exceptions to that throughout our history, of course. FDR is maybe the most recent basic one, but what about that? I mean, is that a viable alternative to what we're seeing here, and that maybe our distress over what's happened in the last 6 months is perhaps just a blip in the historical progression of our nation's preferences?
You was looking at me? We usually do switch over every periodically. Whether it's every 8 years or not is another question. But that does beg the question of why not one of the mainstream Republican candidates? Why Trump? And I know a lot of people who said, I would not vote for any of those Republicans. I'm going to back Trump because he's going to mess everything up. And that is significant. And Trump is not, to my mind, a politician at all. He's a salesman. He sold whatever sold. The population was there waiting for him to jump into it, and the Republicans created that population with their narrative. So I think that everyone said it was a hard road this last election season for a Democrat, and I think that was right. And there's another whole story on the Democratic side, but Trump is more than just, we're sick of Woodrow Wilson, let's try Harding. Trump is, we're sick of Woodrow Wilson, let's try, Darth Vader,
One, then the 1, 2, 3, 4.
So thank you very much. I'm actually from Switzerland, which is not ground zero, and I'm working on a book at the Center for International Development on small countries and those that have been more successful in addressing a lot of these issues. But I'm just sort of wondering if you framed your analysis and across maybe a bit differently in terms of place, party, and time. So, I mean, Homo mentioned the fact that we have these, there's this crack, this huge. It's not just in the United States. I mean, it's happening in a lot of places, Brexit, et cetera. And there's this tendency to sort of blame everything on Trump, but why not look at the causes of that crack? So that would be one observation. You also sort of emphasize the division between the Republican and the Democratic Party, but I don't think anybody, as far as I could gather, in the Republican Party really wanted Trump. And I think he was elected despite the Republican Party. So I'm wondering whether that analysis is accurate. And then, of course, we all have a desire for coherence and continuity, et cetera, so in terms of trajectory. But I wonder whether we're just in a place right now which is very different, sort of a Cambrian moment where things are just really not the same as they were in these periods, and your sort of attempt to try to find some sort of convenient, parallel to other times. But I mean, look at the media, for example, how we digest and discover information, and our ability to change people's minds, given Facebooks and how that sort of entrenches views and reinforces views, et cetera. So, I just think that the way I would sort of look at this would be very different across those three dimensions.
Thank you. Should we have another couple of questions? The lady with the orange scarf, the lady, no, not for you. The lady with the, you have a question, don't you?
Yeah, I have a, I love it. I love it. It's fine. I would take it any day. My question is about recrafting this narrative of we-ness, specifically in a realm of alternative facts and fake media in rural-urban divides. How can we put forth this narrative of some type of unity when there's so many impediments in terms of honesty, truth, and just geography to get those on the table? And specifically, how can students who are not scholars yet, such as me, partake in that alongside scholars like you all?
So two good questions, and we have a panel, and these are questions for the panel. So why don't we start somewhere else and then work back to you? Richard, you have been on the stump talking about the Brexit.
I have been on the stump talking about Brexit because I'm probably unique in this room, maybe in this town, in defending Brexit from the left, what is known in the trade as the Lexit here. And part of my reason for that actually is relevant to this because as I said, I have this slightly unusual take. I think that something like Brexit is the way of avoiding something like Trump. That is to say, it's the way of making sure that radical right-wing politicians don't actually get governmental power. And that is illustrated by the complete collapse of UKIP and Farage. Farage, as you may know, has stood for Parliament 7 times and failed to get in every time. The only UKIP member of Parliament is a Conservative who changed sides and has never, well, he actually did stand for by-election, but anyway. Basically, UKIP is useless as a parliamentary force, and I think it's condemned to permanent uselessness precisely because the sort of issue which occasions the rise of a radical right, which is this sort of this sense of powerlessness, has been, at least one would hope, now taken to some degree off the table in Britain, and that's why I supported Brexit, why I pushed for Brexit, and why I hope its consequences are going to be benign rather than malign, and that in quite a lot of continental Europe, though of course not Switzerland, one sees exactly the point I'm making, which is the rise of the radical right for governmental power in these structures. And the British may have dodged this bullet, at least that's what I hope. And I think that there is a structural problem in America for that reason. That's the structural problem. That's really what was prompting me to ask these questions. Mm-hmm. Because I take the opposition to the EU to be, in a sense, an opposition to a certain kind of, in practice, neoliberal constitutional order that is imposing a variety of structures on the individual countries, precluding things like nationalization, all that stuff is off the agenda. It's illegal under the rules of the EU. So, I mean, I won't say more than that, but just Hermie wanted me to relate to that point. But I think then they are connected, but they're connected the other way around from the way everyone thinks. That Brexit is the solution to Trump. It's not the same thing as Trump.
And what would be the Brexit solution for Trump?
Well, this is back to this question of how do we reconstruct American institutions in the thoroughgoing way that they now seem to require. And I don't know. I mean, I think I'm not sure I would say simply, as Heather does, the vote, because the vote is very highly constrained. You can vote all you like, and the Supreme Court is still going to tell you what to do for the next generation. So I am at a loss, actually.
So, Claudine, I think that's also a question for you from our friend in the audience, because of the structural racism. And I think this also goes back to something that Steve said. I mean, why is it that inequality, economic inequality, should always articulate itself in racial terms? I don't, I mean, that it has happened, I don't know. Why it should happen, I don't know.
Because in some ways, we shouldn't be that surprised because kind of that's the culture that we live in. I mean, I think that the culture of, for example, anti-Black socialization, it's so integral. It's the air we breathe. So in some ways, it's not surprising that that would be sort of the default posture at a moment of economic stress, to think that, you know, Blacks are undeserving because they're culturally unfit or biologically inferior, that women are less capable, that immigrants are really just loyal to their home country. I mean, I think that thinking is reflexive because it's is just baked into our society. But I do want to believe that there's some way to open this up. And I just can't, I can't figure out what that is.
But is this
And-
connected to slavery? Is it the history of slavery that has given this kind of modular form to
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
to the association of economic inequality with prejudice?
I think it's an inescapable part of the story.
It is an
Absolutely.
inescapable-
I
it's
think so.
both
I think so. I
I
think
was just
so.
teaching
So,
James Baldwin The Fire Next Time,
Hmm.
and it's such a resonant text at the moment
Yeah.
to deal with fear, to deal with paranoia,
Yeah.
violence, etc. But the thing I like most about it, the thing that gives me most hope, is when he says, "I'm an American aristocrat. I was one of the earliest people who came to this country. Why is this a white country?
right.
By
Yeah.
whose definition is this a white country? I don't get it."
Yeah, and I mean, so the other thing I would say is that, so I am skeptical about the real potential for a durable, partisan realignment that's not pure evil. I mean, I do think there's the possibility of a realignment, that is led by Bannon's vision of economic nationalism. I think that, but so like the non-evil realignment, that might be an opportunity. It's hard for me to imagine that coming to fruition, but at the same time, I do think that there are ways in which protest can put pressure on the current facts on the ground to, again, not affect a durable partisan realignment, but to save us from a president that literally wants to bring this country to its knees. And but I think figuring out how to build the momentum around that kind of a protest and that kind of pressure, that's the hard part, because I agree with you that, it's the sort of existential threat to democratic institutions and laws and traditions that really are the things that we should be protesting about. So I love the way you framed your opposition to Gorsuch, because I think it's spot on. But how do you get people worked up about a threat that it's an important threat, but it's so diffuse? How do you make that feel urgent and tangible so that you can actually elicit the kind of outrage you need to get people into the streets? And that's the part that is harder to figure out.
Another question. Question here, 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 and there. Somebody keeping all these questioners in mind. Yeah. Keep showing your hand if you're not talking.
This is somewhat related to the last question, but I'm just interested in what happens when we get really good at absorbing shocks and we become accustomed to absorbing shocks. So I'm thinking of like a lot of the conversation that's gone around about a kind of new normal or normalizing Trump or treating this as just another instance of something that we've seen. And so on the one hand, shocks can be distracting, but they can also kind of compel attention and wake people up. So I'm wondering what you think about the related but slightly different problem of shocks losing their shock value and the problem of people having been woken up but now just might go back to sleep, essentially.
So the shock absorber problem.
My question is actually related, because I was actually struck by the, in your original Facebook post about your concern about how we would respond. And I guess my question is, how are we doing? We've seen popular response, people in the streets, people protesting at airports. We've seen the courts weigh in, so institutional response. And so the question that I'd be interested in anyone's response to this, how are we doing in responding to these things?
Let's take a third question from, yes, that's right. And then we come back. Yes, let's take a third question, then we go around the family. Yep.
Well, this is actually related, so this is perhaps good. But why is there so much consternation over an alleged quote-unquote shock when the president issues a temporary travel ban on a few Muslim-majority countries, and yet when the Clintons were in the White House for 8 years, they were carrying out sanctions against Iraq, which according to UNICEF were killing an estimated 5,000 Iraqis a month, and there was no such shock registered among the American public. There was no shock when Obama and Clinton were bombing Libya and killing tens of thousands, when Obama was carrying out his drone campaign, the day-to-day conditions civilians in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera? Is shock a partisan type of issue? Is it made more indifferent? Are people more indifferent when a presumed progressive carries out atrocities? Are we just inured to foreign policy not being at all shocking anymore when it's not something that we have boots on the ground there?
Thank you very much. Free-spirited question.
Can I go back to the last question? Do we have one more, Homie, before we, okay. I didn't want to let us skip the student's question because I think that's a very important question. The fact you're here is the first step. The second thing I think you should recognize is that we were all where you are. That's where we started. So stay engaged, make your voice heard, but there is a limit to what any single one of us can do. There are ways of amplifying our voices, but the question that was asked about the way that social media and the way that our narrowcasting has changed the world, I was thinking part of what kept the shock in the 50s from being absorbed was that there was a responsible news media and a responsible United States Army that spoke up against McCarthy. And what we're missing now is that kind of coming together that I think Heather quite properly identified as what has been essential for keeping these principles alive. If we lose that, we're in serious trouble. So don't stop speaking out.
I'd actually like to pull a bunch of these together and suggest that the elephant that we are not talking about is Russian interference in this election. Because because I'm an idealist, I believe ideas matter, that the way people think about things really, really matters. And so one of the things that, we've talked about are the lies and false news, fake news, and everything coming up. We are at the place we're in because we're in the middle of a human revolution, a technological revolution. It's the internet. And the internet has changed all of American history, and all of world history, but certainly all of American history. And we have access to fake ideas as well as real ideas, and we're not yet very good at figuring out how to figure out what we should be following and what we shouldn't be following. And you can see now, Twitter is identifying things that are perceived to be that are not factual. Facebook has started to do it as of this week. That will have a lot to do with taking a narrative back. Now, in terms of the question of how younger people can get involved, the other elephant that we are not talking about, and by the way, if you're following at all the bots that follow American stories, Russian interference in our political system has not changed at all. We are, in a way, in the middle of a coup. An international coup on this country that is being done in our minds. And that's what I study. That's why I see it. And that's worth paying attention to. But the other demographic that we are not talking about on this panel, and look how old we are, is that there's a huge demographic underway, at least in America. I can't speak to any other country. But the America that people like you are growing up in is not the one we grew up in. And to the degree that that demographic, if you look right now as of August, not of this last year, but the year before that, millennials outnumbered baby boomers in the American demographic. And of course, that's going to get different every year as the baby boomers die. Is your reality the same as ours? I would suggest no, that the internet has created a new American, if you will, a new human, but I only study America, a new American, and our lives were bounded by political narratives that came, I would argue, out of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So they're formed not only in slavery, but also in the addition of national taxes after the war that gave us the equation that said that tax dollars to support a government that protects equality of opportunity simply is a redistribution of wealth. That's how we get the link between socialism, communism, and black rights, for example, in America, which is just weird, except that it comes out of Reconstruction. That reality that we grew up with, the binary world, if you will, and which fit really nicely over the Cold War, by the way, and is very much the world that people like Bannon are grabbing hold of. They love binary worlds because they're the good guys and the rest of us are the bad guys. I don't think for your generation, for some members of your generation, I think that has resonance. But I think for people who are actively engaged in the world through the internet, do you really see the world as being a binary? I would suggest probably not. And I would also suggest that I, anyway, can't see what you're going to do because my world is so different than yours. And I find that an extraordinarily hopeful thing and not a negative thing. So again, I'm not entirely sure that us sitting here saying we're all going to hell in a handbasket is accurate, because you guys should be getting involved in politics, should be calling your congresspeople, should be running for office, should be engaged in American political, civic life, way more than we should. Take it over.
Could I just make a quick point about this? Because there is a very relevant thing, which Claudine probably knows about too. One of our colleagues in the department here, Yasha Monk, has done some very interesting work, which shows actually something which I'm afraid goes the other way, which is right across the Western world. There is an almost exact correlation between the age of the respondent in opinion polls and their support for democracy. That it simply goes like that. And that's true in the US, it's true in Australia, it's true in New Zealand, it's true in Britain, it's true in Sweden, and so on. This is a very chilling fact.
But I saw those. I
there's
saw
a
that.
problem with it.
Yeah, I saw those statistics, and the question was asked in a really funky way. I'm not entirely willing to sign up. I follow him on Twitter, so I read all the stuff. I'm not at all sure that I'm ready. I mean, maybe I just want to believe something different. But do people really want to have somebody have control over their lives? Yeah, some people do. But I think most of us don't.
I think those analyses are quite problematic, and they've been questioned in pretty rigorous
But I think
ways. But there is something to the point, and I think one thing to say is that the hopeful message, again, predicated on the fact that the young are not susceptible to these sort of binary, Manichaean, populist claims. I think that's true in many Western democracies, but we are seeing the rise of a bimodal age distribution and support for populist politicians in France and Germany and elsewhere, where we have young people coming out and supporting Front National in France and supporting the AfD in Germany, saying, you know what, we're young Germans and we're sick of feeling ashamed for World War II and our Nazi past. Let's be nationalist again, right? And so that's actually quite disturbing, and I wonder whether that's, we haven't seen that in the US. We haven't seen it in a number of other Western European countries, so hopefully that trend will not spread. But the other thing I wanted to say is to respond to these two questions about sort of the getting used to the shocks. I think that is actually the single biggest danger of the Trump candidacy and the Trump presidency, and that is the violation of norms. Had Trump lost, we would have still been stuck with this problem. The fact that you can all of a sudden say things publicly that you couldn't say before, that you can therefore do things that you couldn't do before, I think is a tremendous threat to American democracy, but also to social order and human dignity. My immediate reaction when the election, I actually met with Claudine over lunch, I think the day after, right? And I was terrified about what's going to happen to our students, right? Who all of a sudden overnight are under tremendous threat from federal enforcement agencies, but also just from people on the street. I had students coming to me telling me that they were being heckled and yelled at and had racial slurs thrown at them in Cambridge 2 days after the election, on the same streets they walked safely around just a few weeks prior. Same thing in Berkeley, same thing in all these liberal enclaves where all of a sudden people are willing to speak up, whereas before they couldn't, or they felt they couldn't. And so I think that this question of no longer being shocked by what we used to be shocked by just so recently, that's a real danger. Trump will eventually be voted out of office, let's hope. Some of the policies, terrible policies that he's pursuing will hopefully be reversed at some point, or maybe they'll fail, as many have been so far, and let's hope that will continue. But the norm violations, I think, that's a genie that's hard to put back in the bottle. And so how are we doing? If I can just briefly say, I think one thing that's shameful is that the Republican Party is not standing up to this. One thing that's a little bit reassuring is that the media finally are sort of doing their job. Not everyone, not all the time, but compared to the massive failure during the campaign of virtually every media organization, to now, fortunately, Trump waged war on them. They don't like that. And so they're holding his feet to the fire, at least to some degree. And that's hopeful, although it hasn't been constant, right? After the address to Congress, they hailed, this is finally Trump, the president has shown up. Well, that lasted about 6 hours. So, I think there is some reason to hope, though, that media organizations are kind of holding him accountable to some degree. Whether that lasts, what effect it has, I think we'll find out.
I think there was a good question there about international politics and shock and awe, which seemed to get absorbed quite quickly. And I think that international perspective we really do need to confront and engage with before we close this up. So let's have that a response to that question, that there were huge violations of norms, of rights, of boundaries, borders, drones, territorial breaches, a rampant kind of flinging around of sovereignty on the Democratic side? Is that part of we Americans?
I would like to suggest on that front that part of the problem with why people didn't engage with those things when they happened was because the right turned to everything that the Democrats did and declared they were always at DEFCON 5. So the things that, Benghazi, and the problem with being always at DEFCON 5 is that when something really you should pay attention to happens, you got nothing. And everybody says, well, you've been crying wolf far too long. So I think there was that problem in that sort of thing. But there's another piece of this that I get into a lot because no politician does everything you want. And you can't, good luck finding somebody who does everything you like. And it's way easier to complain about everything everybody else is doing wrong than to come up with positive solutions yourself. And people make big mistakes in power. We all make mistakes, but I can't think of a president who wasn't a royal screw up in some way or another. And one of the things we do is we tend to focus on those screw ups and to taint somebody with that if we don't like them. And I think this is one of those cases where, I was not 100% on board for any president we've had, and some I liked a lot more than others. But to sort of throw them all in the same basket and say, well, we have to excuse collusion with a foreign power because we don't like drones, I think they're different things. I think there is such a thing as a principle, and I think that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and we may not agree on what those things are. But I do think that it is important to recognize that on your side and on the other side, that people have, that things are not always equal, that there is not always a middle ground between two positions, and that it's okay to say, listen, I can't stand anything Barack Obama did because of these principles. That's fine.
Not the actions, not necessarily the personality. I don't care who carries it out. Whether if Trump does the same thing, I'll criticize him for the same reasons, but it hasn't changed.
But the issue here is more about what is permissible how permissible are certain American ideas or political ideas outside of America. I think this is the question.
Absolutely.
What is America outside, looking outside? But let me take the question from you and then the final question here from Shugato. So please ask your question, then a question here, and then we do panel response, and we close out.
Certainly. My name is Aaron. I'm from Kansas, and I was shown the door to become a racist, really unpleasant person. I was given that opportunity. That was in front of me, and I turned away from it because something in my heart said, absolutely not.
Who offered it to you?
The people I was around, the culture I was around, the things they said, the way they behaved. Everybody was white. And I turned away. And I have a question. I guess I have two questions. I'm terrified. I'm a white man living in Cambridge, and I am scared every day when I leave my house that somebody is going to do something to me. Now, that to me is, from what I've learned, I did not go to college. I'm pretty uneducated. I've worked most of my life. I'm an artist, and that was that was a ticket for me to kind of be able to do certain things that most of the folks in my background didn't get to do. So I have a question. I have kind of two questions. Is the existence of the African American History Museum significant? Is it as significant in the greater scheme as it is to me personally, having gone there and seen it? I can cry if I think about it too much. And then the other thing is, how close are we to an impeachment, an assassination, a war, whatever? I am so frightened, and I just don't understand. And I'm hoping that you can maybe help me frame those two questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Yeah, sure. Final question.
I was puzzled by what you said about Lincoln in your post. And I'm coming at this issue from a slightly different angle than Richard. Part of your optimism stemmed from a reassembling of a coalition of disparate interests and groups by Lincoln in the North. But he actually, fought a civil war. Why wouldn't you emphasize that? And that's why I'm asking, this seems to be a revolutionary moment with possibilities of violence. Why choose one aspect of Lincoln's coalition building over his determination to fight a civil war? And if I may permitted a second question or comment, I don't think that we can actually address the crisis of American democracy. I agree with you that American democracy is on the line, without posing the question about a general crisis of democracy. Democracy is on the line in many parts of the world, and in India we had our Trump moment, if you will, at least 2.5 years before it happened here. But on the day that Trump was elected, there was another shock that was delivered in India on the 8th of November. This was a demonetization, sort of 86% of the currency taken out of circulation. And there, I think, economists responded by suggesting that this made absolutely no economic sense. But that was not the purpose of what Modi was doing. He was wanting to actually sow chaos. It was on the face of it an economic shock, but in fact it was creating the conditions for promoting a project of religious majoritarianism, in which he succeeded, in a major state election in the most populous state in India. So does it really matter whether it's, it's a Muslim ban, a travel ban? Do you see the prospect of a Trump presidency delivering an economic shock? Or is that not on the cards, that, he will be focusing on creating these, racial divides, the othering kind of project? Or can any kind of shock just be resorted to create the conditions of chaos?
Thank you. So the impeachment question, I think the African American Museum question might be a little bit of a reach. It's a wonderful, I don't know how many people have been there, of course people could respond. But let's take the impeachment question, and then let's take the, the diversity of shocks.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed.
So-
Assassination,
Yes.
impeachment, and war.
Yes, very important.
So actually, they go together in the sense that, first of all, could a shock be anything? Yes. And second of all, is there an economic agenda here? I will point out that tomorrow's vote in the House has an $880 billion redistribution of wealth upward. That's not an accident. That's with a B, billion. And those, again, there's a longer story to be talked about there in terms of narrative and getting people behind a new way to look at American history. There is a massive economic project at work, has been since at least 1980, and it hurts the vast 99% of Americans. And they might disagree about sex, they might disagree about race, they might disagree about any number of things, but my God, they can agree on that if we start focusing on that. But the larger question then is there a project underway, and what kind of a shock event might trigger it? Could be pretty much anything. But it brings up the question of the fact we are terribly unsettled, and how close are we to impeachment, assassination, or war, which people ask me all the time, actually. And I don't like to go on the record about assassination. I think that's a very bad thing to talk about. And we have had assassinations in our past, and I could talk at great length about them if we were not being filmed. I think that we don't put that on the table. But that does bring up the question of why did I focus on Lincoln's positive aspects and not his negative aspects? And the first of those is that I do believe that there is a positive message that can be gleaned from that we can rewrite America any day. I mean, ideas change. We can start the rewriting yesterday, or at least today, if we want to. And the other piece of that, I think, is that Americans, some scholars have argued over the years that Americans don't like to engage in domestic wars since the Civil War because it cost us 600,000 lives and $5 to $6 billion, and the country has really never recovered. And it is my hope, we're in a funny moment because we actually have a generation that really has not seen war. Our wars, we have been, actually, as of the 20th of March, we have been in Iraq for 14 years. Afghanistan for longer, but most of us don't see that war because the people who are getting so terribly maimed in it tend to be from a specific socioeconomic background that many of us don't have a lot of contact with, and that's a tragedy of epic proportions. But that most of us don't want to go to war, that really we understand that picking up guns and killing people is not for Americans a solution. Now, there's a lot of people who like to posture, and there's the two guys in South Carolina today or in the South Carolina legislature. They made the news, I forget which channel, CNN probably, about how they're actually stockpiling weapons and survivalists out there in the country, and they're going to destroy American society, and they're going to live. And there are a few people who think it's a lovely thought. I hope that having had that experience in our pasts, we recognize that that's a fantasy. And I really hope that, because there are armed people who think that it would not be an unreasonable thing to launch a war against the government. And that will not stop easily. Once people start firing on each other, they tend to really become tribal. You look at how it's happened in many countries that seemed peaceful until the firing started. And America, under those circumstances, would be truly horrific. So one of the reasons I emphasize not Lincoln's response to an attack on the government, by the way, he did not launch that war. It was a response to the fact that the rebels launched an attack on the U.S. government. We talk about the Union and the Confederacy like they're equal. They were not equal. The Union was the U.S. government, and the Confederates were a rebellious organization trying to destroy the U.S. government, and he responded to that. I hope it doesn't come to that. Under this president, I don't know what the answer would be if it came to that. But I do think it's important to recognize that there is a positive message that we can take from this. One of those positive messages is that I hope we're not aiming for war. I hope that we are not aiming for assassination. That brings up any number of problems. But the impeachment question is really quite a different one. That's a political question, and that's a different question than the philosophical question of how we change American society. Impeachment is not going to happen because of gerrymandering. The Republicans who are in the House of Representatives, who are the people who are responsible for impeachment, have no reason at all to impeach Donald Trump. I don't think they're going to get Donald Trump on impeachment. I actually don't think he's going to be in office, though, through the summer. I think he's going to be out of office before the end of the summer. And I think that because, and that's a bold prediction, and that's probably wrong, but I think that because of, I think Manafort or Stone are going to turn state's evidence. And I think it's probably going to be Manafort, although I think Manafort is probably fearing for his life at this point. If he does turn state's evidence, I think the rate at which people who've been involved in this Russian problem are disappearing is striking, and Manafort's an idiot if he doesn't think he's on the list. But I think they're probably going to end up getting Donald Trump either on criminal charges, or more likely he's going to see it coming and resign. The man's 70 years old. He did not want to be president. At what point does he simply take his marbles and GTFO? And if I were him, it would absolutely be on my phone that I'm tweeting on, when the next plane is out of, first to my bank and then out of the country. So impeachment's never going to happen, at least with this House. But I really don't think we're going to see a 4-year Trump presidency. I think it would be a shock. And that's one of the reasons I think we shouldn't go forward with Gorsuch. I think that somebody else can appoint him, but I think that Trump is not going to end up being a legitimate president for 4 years.
I just want to say that. I just want to say that's. I mean, I think it's awesome that you've gamed this out. I mean, I've thought about all the paths that could lead to something less than 4 years, but not that one. But I totally agree with your initial assessment that impeachment is really, really unlikely. And because for that to get any momentum, you need Republicans to be behind it. And they've been demonstrating time and time again that their loyalty to party and to power is far greater than their loyalty to what's best for the nation. And without that, it's just not going to go anywhere.
I think also that it's the only thing that explains Trump's willingness to go with this conventional conservative Republican line on health care, which in a way you wouldn't expect him to necessarily, this is his way of fending off impeachment. Yeah. You know, he's thrown them this major bone and they're not going to turn it down.
Well, any further comments from the panel?
May you be right.
Thank you very much.